So, I mean, I guess my first question would be, we're in the midst of an incredible movement moment. Folks are all over the country, have been organizing for over 7 years, if not longer, trying to turn Black Lives Matter into a movement that can impact not just protest, but also policy. I did have a chance to read both versions of the contract with Black America, and I'm just curious, are there activists or organizers in this movement that you've been connected to who have been doing some of this legislative advocacy and policy advocacy work?
Yeah, we connected with ADOS, and we helped get a bill passed in California. Governor Gavin Newsom passed AB 3121, which starts the conversation about reparations in California. So we have been connected with, a grassroots organization. We want to connect with as many grassroots organizations who are not connected to any other so-called powers that be, strictly grassroots. And we definitely want to connect with them, people who definitely have no ulterior motives, who really just want to see money get in the hands of the people who built this country and the ancestors and family of the people that built this country.
Do you think that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization?
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't Black.
So my question for you is, what do you think? Where do you think we're going to be able to hold this guy accountable, man? You think we're going to be able to get progressive actions taken? You think we're going to get some version of Black liberation out of, as you see these picks roll in to, because I don't even think you were on before the election. You haven't been on since the election, have you? No, you haven't.
No, not since the election, but I was on right before.
Right. So what are you thinking?
Okay, let me pull this apart a little bit. And in no way am I choosing between the two of you. Here's what I think. I think that we're in trouble as it relates to this administration. We're in trouble. And the reason we're in trouble is because we're facing an arrangement where people think they're rooted in an era of politics that is gone. He got bars for anybody who wants to challenge him on how he sees the world. Right. And especially in relationship to his relationship with Black people. So that's some shit we need to be careful of. Because Jim Clyburn got him out here feeling himself, child. Yes. And that is going to be an impediment to Black folks getting the things that Black folks need, because according to Joe Biden, Black folks have already spoken, and he has all the Black voices that he needs, and it ain't us.
We've never fully lived up to the founding principles of this nation, to state the obvious, that all people are created equal and have a right to be treated equally throughout their lives. And it's time to act now, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because if we do, we'll all be better off for it. For too long, we've allowed a narrow, cramped view of the promise of this nation to fester. You know, we've bought the view that America is a zero-sum game in many cases. If you succeed, I fail. If you get ahead, I fall behind. If you get the job, I lose mine. Maybe worst of all, if I hold you down, I lift myself up. We've lost sight of what President Kennedy told us when he said, "A rising tide lifts all boats."
President John F. Kennedy once said about economic development that, quote, "a rising tide lifts all boats," end quote. Kennedy was, of course, right, but he missed something really, really important. A rising tide only lifts your boat when you have a boat.
During this election, there was a civil war going on in the black community. And it was all based on political strategy. On one side, you had the establishment and mainstream black America just saying, we got to get Trump out of office. On the other side, you had black people saying, we have to be more mature about our politics, and we need to leverage our vote in order to get some policy that will benefit our communities. Unfortunately, the latter has lost this battle. And as a result, Joe Biden has given the CBC, Black Lives Matter, NAACP, any motherfucking group that is black and is supposed to be representing mainstream black America, all those groups, Joe Biden has given those groups his ass to kiss. And what we have gotten out of this whole thing is this executive order. So after we have given this motherfucker the presidency and we have given him Congress, this is the thing that is supposed to be for black America in exchange. Have you noticed that nothing in the title of this executive order says black, African American, the descendants of American chattel slavery? Nothing that would clearly define who is going to benefit from this executive order. It is just something that we are supposed to assume is for us and will benefit us. And that's the scam that the Democrats have been running for decades. But we're about to dig into all of this to show you the smoke and mirrors of it all.
We need to open the promise of America to every American. And that means we need to make the issue of racial equity not just an issue for any one department of government. It has to be the business of the whole of government.
All right, through this whole video, you should see a pattern. And it should be a familiar pattern to you by now. And that's when it's time to develop policy or anything that will benefit black Americans who descend from American chattel slavery. Somehow the terminology gets very, very vague. But it may not even seem like it's being vague because of how they put these words together. For instance, when you hear terminology like racial equity, you might assume that they're talking specifically about the discrimination that has been enforced by the American government against the black people who descend from American chattel slavery. The reality is that they're never specific about who this racial equity is for. And when you go through this executive order, you start to realize that this has very little to do with race at all. All right, so let's get into this. The first red flag for me is that it starts off talking about equal opportunities. Look, after centuries of us being excluded from the opportunities, we're past the point of you trying to offer me a goddamn opportunity. Now you got to offer me something that is more concrete. But anyways, let's look at this language. Entrenched disparities in our laws and public policies and in our public and private institutions have often denied that equal opportunity to individuals and communities. A historic movement for justice has highlighted the unbearable human cost of systematic racism. I guess that's the BLM shout out. Sidebar. You have been incompetent enough to stay within the good graces of the establishment. You have undermined other organizations and individuals' attempts to actually get things done. And your own chapters are in open revolt because they see through your bullshit And after selling us all out, you can't even get a name drop from the Democratic Party? Now it's time to pay attention to the tricky language. So it says the federal government should pursue a comprehensive approach to advancing equity for all. Now, for all should tell you that this isn't specifically for black people, and the should tell you that they're not promising to do anything. But if you're confused about whether or not this shit is actually for your black ass, they go further to explain how they're not really talking about you, including people of color and others who have been historically underserved, marginalized, and adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality. Now, people of color is a term that does not mean black people. It means everyone besides white people. And when they throw in the others, now they're talking about white people too. All right, so this is where the game playing gets interesting, right? So they're saying in dealing with this issue of equity, essentially everyone would benefit. And they use this example. An analysis shows that closing racial gaps in wages, housing credit, lending opportunities, and access to higher education would amount to an additional $5 trillion in gross domestic product in the American economy over the next 5 years. So the point of using this, well, let me back up. They don't exactly tell you where this analysis is from or who are these racial groups that we're actually talking about, like who specifically is losing out as far as these racial gaps. You're just supposed to assume that it's black people who descend from American chattel slavery, because that's the discussion that everyone is having when they're talking about racial gaps. But they never clarify that. Also, the point of putting this in here is to kind of give you a subliminal message that this is going to be the focus behind whatever report or plan that comes out of this whole executive order. But I need you to understand that this is just an example that they're using in the middle of this whole thing. They are not stating that this is the actual goal of this executive order. All right, and this is really the slap in the face that they do constantly in government, right? So the same agencies that were in charge of enacting the discriminatory practices against us are the same agencies that they want to assess or fix, well, in this case, just assess how they actually discriminated against us. Why not create a whole other agency to be in charge of this? Because then you have an agency that isn't biased. But anyway, let me just go ahead and read this part of the executive order. Consistent with these aims, each agency must assess whether and to what extent its programs and policies perpetuated systematic barriers to opportunities and benefits for people of color and other underserved groups. Just to make it clear, this is not specifically for us.
That's why I issued, on one of the first days, my whole government executive order that will, for the first time, advance equity for all throughout our federal policies and institutions. It focuses on the full range of communities who have been long underserved and overlooked. People of color, Americans with disabilities, LGBTQ Americans, religious minorities, rural, urban, suburban communities facing persistent poverty.
The term equity means the consistent and systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including individuals who belong to underserved communities that have been denied such treatment, such as Black, Latino, Indigenous, and Native American persons, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders, and other persons of color. Members of religious minorities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, LGBTQ plus persons, persons with disabilities, persons who live in rural areas, and persons otherwise adversely affected by persistent poverty or inequality. The term underserved communities refer to populations sharing a particular characteristic as well as geographic communities. They have been systematically denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civic life, as exemplified by the list in the preceding definition of equity. Do you see how none of this is specific to Black people, even though this is supposed to be the thing that he's throwing out there for Black people? Apparently, every group gets a piece of Black people's pie, but what we're left with is just crumbs.
And I've asked Ambassador Susan Rice to lead the administration's charge through the White House and Domestic Policy Council, because I know she'll see it through. Every White House component and every agency will be involved in this work, because advancing equity has to be everyone's job. Today, I'll be shortly signing an additional package of executive actions to continue this vital work.
Now, I want to be clear that there is nothing in this executive order that outlines how to obtain this equity. What this is just a thing where they're going to study the problem, come up with a report, and then say they have a plan. So let's get into it. The Director of the Office of Management and Budget shall, in partnership with the heads of agencies, study methods for assessing whether agency policies and actions create or exacerbate barriers to full and equal participation by all eligible individuals. All right, so let's go down here so you understand the timeline behind all of this, right? Within 6 months of the date of this order, the Director of OMB shall deliver a report to the President describing the best practices. And then, within 1 year of the date of this order, the head of each agency shall consult with the APDP and the Director of OMB to produce a plan for addressing. And it goes into talking about barriers to full participation in the programs of the agencies and yada, yada, yada. Now, the point of going into this direction of talking about the timeline here is that they're not going to even have a plan until a year from now. That's not even talking about the time to actually start implementing whatever plan they come up with. And by that time, we're going to be talking about the midterms. And the message that's going to be coming to us is that Black people need to just show up so the Democrats can hold on to some seats. And while they're hitting us over the head with this message, none of us are going to see the benefits of this goddamn executive order. But I guarantee you there are going to be people that are going to say Biden did something for Black people based on this goddamn executive order. We have to step up our politics because these motherfuckers are playing games with us. Now, I will be fair And I will say that this part right here talks about engaging with members of underserved communities. Now, none of this means black. None of this means the descendants of American chattel slavery. None of that is in this. But this is something that people will point to and tell you that no, you can't just downplay this executive order because they're going to talk to the right people, apparently, hopefully, whatever the fuck. All right, let's go into this part, right? So, many federal data sets are not disaggregated by race, ethnicity, gender, disability, income, veteran status, or other key demographic variables. This lack of data has cascading effects and impedes efforts to measure and advance equity. Now, this is a problem, right? So for many of us, what we want them to do is disaggregate race and create categories of ethnicity, specifically for black people, or black Americans, I should say, because we want them to clearly define the difference between black Americans who descend from American chattel slavery, with Nigerian Americans, with Jamaican Americans, with Haitians, or etc. But what they're doing here is disaggregating all types of different shit so that other people will be eligible for whatever benefits come out of this thing.
Just imagine if instead of denying millions of Americans the ability to own a home and build generational wealth, we made it possible for them to buy a home, their first home, and began to build equity to provide for their families and send their children off to school.
These were not homes for wealthy people. They were homes to get the white population out of urban areas into the suburbs. Those homes, they say, sold in those days for about $100,000 in today's money. Today, those homes sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, depending on the area of the country. And they are in these suburbs are in every area of the country. This is how the country came to be suburbanized. The white families who moved into those homes with this federal subsidy, you can move out of public housing and move into one of these homes in a place like Levittown and pay less in your monthly housing costs than you were paying for rent in public housing. That's how enormous the subsidy was for white families to do that. They gained over the next 2 or 3 generations $300,000, $400,000 in equity, in wealth. Most middle-class families in this country, not the very wealthy, but most middle-class families in this country gain what wealth they have from the equity they have in their homes. Today, African-American incomes in this country are 60% of white incomes. You would expect that if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. You can, if you have income of the same amount, you can save the same amount. The reality is that today, although the income ratio between blacks and whites is 60%, the wealth ratio is 10%. African Americans have 10% of the average wealth of whites, even though they have 60% of the average income. And that enormous disparity, which affects so much of the racial inequality in this country, so many of the problems we face in this country, is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. Entirely attributable to an unconstitutional housing policy. The wealth gap, the fact that we have segregated neighborhoods still, because homes that sold for $100,000 that in 1950, that was twice national median income. Any working class family can afford that. Homes that sell for today $500,000, 6 or 8 times national median income, are unaffordable to working class families of any race. So we passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. We said in the Fair Housing Act, in effect, okay, African Americans, you can now move to Levittown or to any of these other suburbs. But it was an empty offer because the homes are no longer affordable to working class families of any race.
housing, for example. Housing is a right in America, and home ownership is an essential tool to wealth creation and to be passed down to generations.
Now, this is something that is supposed to be for Black Americans who descend from American chattel slavery, but you'll see that this is all inclusive. During the 20th century, federal, state, and local governments systematically implemented racially discriminatory housing practices that contributed to segregated neighborhoods and inhibited equal opportunity and the chance to build wealth for Black, Latino, Asian American, and Pacific Islander and Native American families and other underserved communities. So we're talking about segregation and redlining, and somehow everyone gets a piece of that history. And apparently everyone was a victim of these governmental practices.
Why did you select Levittown to live?
We were looking for a place to buy a home. We looked at Levittown, and we liked the homes here. We liked the advantages that Levittown seemed to offer in comparison to other cities. And we understood that it was going to be all white, and we were very happy to buy a home here.
Do you think a Negro family moving here will affect the community as a whole?
Definitely.
In what way?
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any number.
Can you give a basis for that judgment?
Yes, we used to live in Washington, D.C., and we saw a very good example of that there.
The repetition of an experience that was distasteful. Is there to be no escape from living near Negroes? And what of the dream of middle-class respectability? If a Negro family can afford what you can afford, how do you justify your feeling of superiority? What other objections, aside from the effect on property values, do you have against the Myers?
The whole thing centers around the word integration.
These include a racial gap in home ownership, a persistent undervaluation of properties owned by families of color, a disproportionate burden of pollution and exposure to the impacts of climate change in communities of color, and systematic barriers to safe, accessible, and affordable housing for people of color, immigrants, individuals with disabilities, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender non-conforming, and queer LGBTQ+ individuals.
Well, I speak from personal experience on this. I went through it. I tried to sell my house. I tried to sell my house for over 2 years before I succeeded, and when I did succeed, I sold it for little more than half of what I had been offered not too long before the black families moved into the neighborhood.
Well, it just depends upon that type of Negro. If they were like the Negro that works for me, a fine, upstanding woman who is proud of being a Negro, proud of her race, clean and industrious, no, I would not mind.
But some of them, they're real dirty. But I wouldn't mind it if, you know, they kept the neighborhood clean.
Well, I think most of them don't keep themselves clean. I think the majority of them let their houses run down and everything.
I'm not in favor of either forced segregation nor forced integration. I think that people should be able to decide this for themselves. My personal preference would be to have white neighbors, and I would not sell to a colored individual, nor would I buy next to one if I could avoid it.
I think that really basically there's a big thing of inferiority and superiority going here, that everyone subconsciously really believes that the Negro is inferior. And this is wonderful because it makes all white people so superior. And you have this marvelous feeling of being just a little bit better than all these black people. And consequently, when you have the black people moving into your neighborhood, it suddenly, you know, the bottom drops out. I mean, if these people can move in, then obviously your neighborhood is no longer what you thought it was. You know, it's no longer really very valuable to you.
on, Hey, don't come back! Don't come back!
Federal government's housing policies and programs expanded home ownership across the country. Many knowingly excluded black people and other persons of color and promoted and reinforced housing segregation. Federal policies contributed to mortgage redlining and lending discrimination against persons of color. So even with this, they're trying to be less vague about the shit, right? But they're still trying to find ways to give other people the benefits that are supposed to go to us. Many urban interstate highways were deliberately built to pass through black neighborhoods, often requiring the deconstruction of housing and other local institutions. To this day, many black neighborhoods are disconnected from access to high-quality housing, jobs, public transit, and other resources. This is our story, but the left and the Democratic Party are determined to replace us in our own history. Now, when you read this whole memorandum, right, it makes it seem as if they are going to try to make up for redlining and segregation. That's not necessarily what this is. What this is they're just saying that going forward, we are not going to discriminate against anyone. What Joe Biden is offering us is a fresh start in 2021. So those decades that white people and other groups have had to get homes and not be involved in this fucked up system of redlining, that's not being taken into account for real. And we can go back even further. We can go back centuries and talk about the goddamn Homestead Act and how we were excluded from that part. And that's something that over 90 million Americans today benefit from. But we're starting fresh in 2021 with everyone having an equal opportunity. Basically, instead of you trying to talk to us about how we can have equal opportunity by getting some type of loan, you need to be talking to us about how you're going to give us grants, money that we don't have to pay back to buy our goddamn homes. You are at least a couple centuries too late to be talking to us about equal opportunities.
Today, I'm directing the Department of Housing and Urban Affairs and Urban Development to redress historical racism in federal housing policies. Today, I'm directing the federal agency to reinvigorate the consultation process with Indian tribes. Respect for tribal sovereignty will be a cornerstone of our engaging with Native American communities. This builds on the work we did last week to expand tribes' access to the Strategic National Stockpile for the first time.
Yeah, so he can be very specific about the tribes, and also he's talking about how they are getting special access to medical supplies.
To ensure they receive help from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to fight this pandemic. Today, I'm directing federal agencies to combat resurgence of xenophobia, particularly against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders that we've seen skyrocket during this pandemic. This is unacceptable, and it's un-American. I've asked the Department of Justice to strengthen its partnership with the Asian American and Pacific Islander community to prevent those hate crimes.
Some of these issues can be handled, we believe, by legislation. Of course, we don't know what will happen in the Senate races in Georgia, and so it's hard to say. We have the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which everyone on this call among our groups worked on and that we think is so important. It's not clear that we have the votes for it, but you know, President-elect, that politics is not about simply saying there are this many Democrats and this many Republicans. The president has power. He has the bully pulpit. He has moral authority. And so we would ask you to lend your voice and your strength and your influence and your power and your ability to reach across the aisle to try and pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. But failing that, we would ask you to pull from that act measures that can be enacted by executive order. You have the power to call for a national database on police misconduct. You have the power to ask for a registry that will allow people to easily search in public multiple misconduct complaints against particular officers. You have the ability to impose a database around police killings and police shootings. We know everything that happens to police officers because the FBI keeps a database, but we rely on the Washington Post to tell us how many people have been shot and killed by the police and what the racial breakdown is of those statistics. We need good data so that we can understand what is really happening around policing. And these are things that you can do by executive order. Most important and most overarching, Mr. President-elect, is the power that you have, and in fact, the obligation that you have under one of the most important civil rights statutes, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prevents the federal government from providing funding to any program that engages in discrimination. It was used originally, and in fact enacted, to compel school districts to comply with desegregation orders, recalcitrant school districts. But Title VI applies across the board to every program. It makes sense, right? The federal government should not be funding programs engaged in discrimination, but it has never been enforced against law enforcement. And I would ask that you would articulate clearly the indication, the intention of this administration to apply Title VI to every program. If you are a state or local program and you engage in discrimination, you cannot receive federal funds. What that means is that there needs to be created a kind of protocol for Title VI. And you could do this very easily for law enforcement. What do your diversity numbers look like? What do your stop and arrest numbers look like by race? What do your shooting numbers look like by race? Do you have implicit bias training? What have you done to remove white supremacists from your police departments? These are actions that you can take that indeed I would suggest you are compelled to take by Title VI, which requires the federal government to ensure that their programs, their money does not support programs that engage in discrimination. Finally, I want to say something about prisons, which I know has not come up. We know that the Department of Justice has the power to address issues of policing through pattern and practice investigations. I want to encourage you to add prisons to that as well. I want to inform you, Mr. President-elect and Vice President-elect, that there is a prison tragedy that is unfolding because of COVID. We will find out about it more in the coming 6 months. I encourage you to use your power to order an investigation of state and local prisons and jails to find out precisely what is happening, and you have that power through the Department of Justice. And that brings me to the Department of Justice, which is one of the principal ways through which you'll be able to execute criminal justice reform. It is vitally important, and that means the leadership of the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, is critical.
And so there's some things that I'm going to be able to do by executive order. I'm not going to hesitate to do it. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to do what Benita, you probably used to get angry with me during the debates, when you'd have some of the people you were supporting said, on day one, I'm going to executive order to do this. Not within the constitutional authority. I am not going to violate the Constitution. Executive authority that my progressive friends talk about is way beyond the bounds. And as one of you said, maybe you, Reverend now, whether it's far left or far right, there is a Constitution. It's our only hope, our only hope.
I've also asked the Department of Health and Human Services to put out best practices for combating xenophobia in our national response to COVID.
I want to be clear. These executive orders for these other groups are specifically for them. We are not included in their executive orders. but they are included in ours. And they're going to be goofy motherfuckers that try to tell you that Joe Biden did something for black people in his climate change executive order. No, this is another people of color scam.
You know, just ask the first HBCU graduate elected as vice president if that's not true.
Let's really be clear about that. So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No.
I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but this is not specifically for black people. And I think people got a misconception. Like they think that because they're closing these prisons that they're actually letting prisoners out. No, they're just moving them to the other prisons that they have, the public prisons, the ones that are ran by the government instead of the private prisons. And to be clear, the private prisons only make up like 10% of all the prisons that are involved in this whole goddamn prison industrial complex. I just want to put this shit in its proper perspective because I think some people are going to go overboard with how this is some great victory for black people when that is not the case.
I ran for president because I believe we're in a battle for the soul of this nation. And the simple truth is, our soul will be troubled as long as systemic racism is allowed to persist. We can't eliminate it. It's not going to be overnight. We can't eliminate everything, but it's corrosive, it's destructive, and it's costly. It cost every American, not just who felt the sting of racial injustice. We are not just a nation of morally deprived because of systemic racism. We're also less prosperous. We're less successful. We're less secure. So we must change. And I know it's going to take time, but I know we can do it. And I firmly believe the nation is ready to change. But government has to change as well. We need to make equity and justice part of what we do every day. Today, tomorrow, and every day. Now, I'm going to sign these executive actions to continue the work to make real the promise of America for every American. Again, I'm not promising we can end it tomorrow, but I promise you we're going to continue to make progress to eliminate systemic racism, and every branch of the White House and the federal government is going to be part of that effort. Thank you.
I mean it, especially those moments, and especially for those moments when this campaign was at its lowest ebb. The African-American community stood up again for me. You've always had my back, and I'll have yours.
If you had told me when I entered the United States Senate that one of the people that I would have the closest relationship with in the Senate would be Strom Thurmond, I'd have told you you were crazy. Because as Strom told me, he said, Joe, if there has to be a Democrat as president, and I hope it won't happen, he said, it might as well be you. And after I dropped out of the race, he came to me and said, don't worry about it. He said, you got a good 30 years left to try.